There's a few different types of training that we do. So we do specific skills training, so training together as a team to get routines for putting up our tent and for traveling on the skis. But then there's the fitness, the physical training, but also the mental training. A lot of people forget about the mental side of it, but these expeditions are a lot about your approach, your mental approach, and your mental attitude, and how you deal with those mental challenges and psychological challenges that are inevitably part of the whole experience. And then there's the scientific training as well. So there's lots of different strands, and some of that training we do as individuals, and some of it we try and come together to do as a team. Because having a collection of people is a very different thing to having a team, and it takes a surprisingly long amount of time, I think, to really get to the stage where you are truly operating as one unit rather than a collection of individuals, and that's always what we're aiming for.
And how do you do that? How do you go about becoming a team instead of
becoming a team? I mean, I could talk to you for a month straight about all the different ideas around a team, and it really depends, I think, on the individuals that you've got involved. No group of people is the same as another, and it sort of depends on the experience that you've had before and how you've come to be a team or a group of people together. But I think one of the key ingredients, no matter what, is that you have to build that trust and confidence in each other. And if you don't have that trust, it can be really difficult to build everything else that you need. So for me, I think one of the most efficient ways of building that trust and confidence is to throw yourself at something that feels like adversity. Now, it might be that you're doing that in a totally safe environment, but it feels like adversity. So for this team, we went up for a training expedition in Iceland on a glacier called Vatnajökull, which has a really intimidating reputation for sort of chewing teams up and spitting them off the glacier, and we went up there in November, which is a questionable time of year to go up there, a demanding time of year to go up there, and sure enough we got some big storms, and we spent 3 days desperately trying to keep ourselves and our tent and our camp firmly and safely on the ground and not getting blown off. And that was the experience that really fast-tracked the relationships and showed where those relationships were brilliant, but also highlighted some fractures that we needed to address. And so for both those reasons, it was a really valuable experience.
And then talking about cold, are there, and people even in this country, we're thinking, what do we do to keep warm? Or do you do layers? Do you have to do thick layers, thin layers? Are there any sort of hints and tips about us keeping warm, or best ways to keep warm? Or should I wear a hat when I go out? Is that, what's the thing to do?
My big advice for keeping warm is that it's a constant thing. It's not that you do one thing and then forget about it and assume that you're going to be warm from then on in. You have to keep adjusting because your body heat changes, the environment changes, and so it has to be something that's constantly present in your mind. Do I need to take off a layer? Do I need to put an extra layer on? Do I need to move a bit more? Do I need to move a bit less? Do I need to change where I am or change the circumstances around me? So keeping warm is not a one answer thing. It's whatever it is that you're doing to keep warm, you have to keep adjusting it and keep looking at whether it's still working or whether you need to change something or do something different. So that would be my top tip.
Talking about the samples, and we had a little chat earlier about how you take polar samples and things. I wonder if you could just go through that a little bit for us. You know, how do you get from a polar, how do you get a sample from the North Pole back to Southampton to look at, you know, in one piece?
It sounds like a really simple thing, doesn't it? Just go to the Arctic, scoop up some snow and bring it back. But it is so much more complicated than that, and I've spent literally the last 18 months working out how you take a pot to the Arctic and scoop up some snow and bring it back in a way that makes it of any value at all. You know, I could do that very easily, but it could be useless. So the first thing is to make sure you have the right container and that it's prepared in the right way. So I spend a lot of time before the expedition cleaning and preparing the containers in a very clean environment. So I have access here at the National Oceanography Centre to very high specification clean labs where you have to wear protective clothing before you go into the lab. The lab has special air circulation, and then I prepare the containers inside fume cabinets that also prevent contamination of other plastic or fibres or materials getting into the container that I'm going to use. And then those containers are sealed while they're in that very clean environment, and I transport them out to the Arctic. And the Arctic, the reason why there isn't much information about the Arctic is because it's a really difficult, hazardous and expensive region to access. It's really difficult to get there, and it's difficult to be there once you're there because the environment is challenging in all sorts of ways. There's the cold, but there's also the remoteness, and then there's also hazards from the other wildlife, polar bears in the case of the Arctic. So there's all sorts of things that you have to think about, prepare for, train for, and put in measures to reduce those risks as much as you can. I think a lot of people, when they think of polar exploration, they think it's a sort of adrenaline sport, or you know, that you're slightly foolhardy or rash, and it couldn't be more opposite. You have to be very happy sitting in front of a spreadsheet thinking of all the things that could happen, and then trying to think of all the ways that you could reduce the severity of the impact of all those things happening. So you have to be very methodical. You have to, you know, think these things through over and over. And then, only then, do you actually arrive on the ice, and it feels like you've already gone through a huge journey just to get there. And then once you're there, our biggest concern is contaminating what we're trying to sample. So by our very presence on the snow, we could be contaminating that snow with fibres from our clothing, from any plastic items that we're using, from our tents, from our sleeping bags. We could be contaminating the snow that we then sample. So then when I look at that sample, I'm not looking at what was in the snow already, I'm looking at what we have accidentally put in the snow ourselves. So there's a lot of different things that we do to stop that happening. From, we look really bizarre on the ice. We're wearing cotton protective clothing to stop things from our polar clothing that we need to wear to stop fragments contaminating what we're sampling. So we've settled on wearing surgical gowns. So we're wearing bright green surgical gowns, we're wearing big leather welding gloves, and we're wearing big protective overboots over our plastic snow boots that we wear. So we look completely mad out there on the ice.
But nobody sees you. Nobody can see you.
Yeah. So. Thankfully, you know, if anyone came across us, I think it looks like a scene from a horror movie or something, sort of out there on the ice with power tools and surgical gowns. So there's all sorts of ways that we reduce the contamination, and then we seal up those containers and we transport them back to Southampton, and those samples are kept in chillers or freezers until we're ready to process and analyse them. And the way that we look at those samples for microplastic content is that the melted snow and ice is filtered through a very fine filter, so that all the debris that is contained within that snow and ice is deposited on a filter. Then we use spectroscopy to look at, to identify what the stuff is that's been deposited on the filter. So a lot of it might be organic matter that's there through other processes, but of course what I'm interested in is identifying what microplastic content there is, and then trying to identify precisely what type of microplastic that is. And with that information, hopefully I can start to investigate where that content has come from and how it got there, because those are the questions we need to answer if we're to stand any chance of preventing that pollution getting there in the first place. Yeah, the sea ice of the Arctic Ocean. Well, the Arctic Ocean is really unique because it has this frozen coating on the top of it, and that sea ice plays a really important role in our global climate. So not only does it reflect or absorb light that's landing on that surface, but it's also affecting the ocean that's beneath it, and therefore more broadly ocean circulation and also atmospheric circulation. And the polar regions in themselves, are big drivers of these huge global environmental processes. So what is affecting sea ice has huge impact in all sorts of ways globally. Like, no matter where you live in the world, you are affected by what's going on. And sea ice has been rapidly decreasing, not only in extent, but also in the thickness and stability since we've started recording sea ice at all, which started happening in the late 70s. And when you see these data graphs of extent of sea ice, there's a lot of natural variability. Some years there's more sea ice than others, but the whole graph is on this unmistakable tilt down to the present day. So there is less sea ice, but the sea ice that's there is thinner and less stable, so it breaks apart more easily than it has done in the past. It's newer sea ice than it's ever been before. Whereas in years past you get big, thick, multi-year ice that had been around several summers and was really thick and stable. We've lost about 85% of that in recent estimations. So we're just left with the new stuff that can break apart really easily. And if you're looking at an Arctic Ocean that now has much less or thinner sea ice than it had before, that's going to change the amount of sunlight that's absorbed or reflected. That's going to change circulation of the atmosphere above the sea ice and below it. It's going to change the sort of life cycles of the marine life that depends on sea ice. It will have all sorts of implications, and it's unpicking those really complex systems that a lot of scientists are looking at right now to try and not only understand what is happening, but to try and predict what the precise impacts are going to be for all of us.